So this session is called Making It Stick, Incorporating Cognitive Science Research into Textbook Elements. And we have Karen and Laura.
Thank you.
Welcome. Thank you.
Can you hear me okay? Okay, great. So I guess the first thing I wanted to do was to kind of take an idea of who's in the audience. How many people here are textbook authors? Textbook authors. Okay, so how many are academics? Academic authors. Okay, well, so I think there's something in the talk for everybody. So if you're a textbook author, we have something for you. If you're academic, you're teaching, and I think a lot of the things we're going to talk about also apply to teaching in the classroom as well. So this was my idea, and I dragged my friend Karen in to talk about this with me. And just to give you a little bit of background about who we are, so I direct the STEM Education Center, and so I do a lot of things with faculty development, but I also have a textbook. And Karen also has several textbooks. We both publish in the area of chemistry. And so, and what happened was that we both simultaneously were reading this book at the same time, and the book's title is Make It Stick. Oh, she's got a copy of it. So, like, I read it, I was reading it, and I got this email from her, and she said, "Oh, you really have to read this book, Make It Stick." And I was like, I am reading that book. And so what we're going to try to do today is talk a little bit about some of the research that's in the book, and then show you how we incorporated some of the ideas into both of our textbooks. So Karen's got some examples, and because I talk about this a lot with faculty and with K-12 teachers, I'm going to be talking most, and I'll present some of the research that's in the book. Okay, so there it is again. It's written like a novel. It's not written like a research paper. So it's very readable, and I think this is fantastic for the book itself because more people will read it. And so it's called, the subtitle is Science of Successful Learning, and this area of cognitive scientists studying how people learn is now being called the science of learning. And so here's a couple of definitions. Understanding how people learn, or Richard Mayer, who is a very famous cognitive scientist in the area of the multimedia principle, has just called it the scientific study of how people learn. And so what this is really is cognitive scientists doing research in a controlled laboratory setting about finding out how people actually process information. There's still a lot of research that needs to be done in our own classrooms about applying some of this and see how it actually plays out in the classroom. So most of what you're going to see are studies that have been controlled in a controlled laboratory setting, not something from a classroom itself. There's the reference if you want to. All you have to do is make it stick on Amazon and it'll come up. Okay, so we're going to start off. This is going to be audience participation, so I hope you're ready for this. I don't think I have ever done a session here where the audience didn't participate, so this is not going to be any different. Okay, so here's the first question, and if you think the answer is true, then you would say 1, and if you think it's false, then you would say 2, and if you don't want anybody to see your response, then you can put it on your chest and face me, and then I will be the only one that can see how you vote, okay? So here's the first question. Rereading a textbook passage multiple times is a good study strategy for an exam because repetition is a good way to learn. So you're saying either 1, true, or 2, false. Okay, so some of you said 1 and some of you said 2. That is a false statement. And I'll show you some of the research. But before we get to the research, here's another question. Which penny looks like a real penny? Now, you can't cheat and look at a penny in your pocket. And even though these are numbered A through J, there's 10 of them. So if you think it's number 1, if you think it's 2, you got 10 fingers, most people do, so you can say any one of those possibilities. So look at them for a moment here. I'll give you about 30 seconds, and then you can tell me which one you think is the real penny. Okay, you can put your fingers up. Put your fingers up so I can see. Got some 7, 4, 5, 9, 6, 10, 0. Oh, are you joking? Like, which one looks like the real penny? Oh, you don't think any of them? Okay. Well, it turns out, so there were multiple answers among the crowd. It's actually A, the first one. Okay, and the reason I put this in there is because even though we see a penny regularly in everyday life, like rereading, we may not remember just from seeing it that it looks like that, right? And so, but you know, if you don't believe that, we have more research to show you about rereading. So this was a study that was done at the university level on, they had 117 students, and they asked them, what are the top 3 ways that you study? Okay, and so it was open-ended questioning, and they asked them, how do you study? And 84% of the students said that they reread their notes or their textbook. And of the top 3 answers, so that was 84% of the top 3 answers, 55% of them said that was their top strategy. Now, if you think penny had something to do with that, so I just tried to show you quickly that rereading doesn't really have any effect. But there's still other studies that have been done. Okay, so here's some more evidence. So in 2009, there was a study done by Calendar McDaniel, and what they did is they had people read a passage, and then a week later, they had them answer some questions about the passage that they read. The second group got to read the passage 3 times in succession, and then they waited, and about a week later, they gave them a test. There was no difference in the scores. So did the rereading help? In this case, you'd have to say no. And why is that? Because students, and if you've ever had students, they will say, well, I reread the passage 1,000,000 times. I studied for 5 hours. I reread, and why didn't I do well on the test, right? And that is because they are very familiar with the content. It doesn't necessarily mean that they understand the content, because they've read it so many times they think they know it, but they really aren't engaging with it. And so that's the idea here, is that familiarity with the content does not mean that you understand the content. So in another study, they had students read a passage, wait at least 24 hours, and then they read the passage again, and then that week later, they took a test on the material, and then those students did better. So what is happening here, and why is this reread different? Okay, so that's what we want to kind of explore that a little bit. But before we do that, we have to think about who's reading the book. Who are they? Why are they reading the book? Okay, and I like to talk about this book, Green Eggs and Ham, because everybody's read that book or they've heard of it. There's kind of 2 levels of this book. There's the concrete level of the ending of the story, which is the guy ate green eggs and ham and he decided he liked them. And then, of course, the other level of the story is don't knock something until you try it. And, as learners and readers, we fit into one of these categories. We are either readers that learn through examples, example learners. These are students or readers that build very low structure. They don't know what they're reading and how they can organize what they're reading, okay? that's one type of person. These are also your concrete thinkers. And then the other level of reader and learner is a high structure builder. These are people who can think in the abstract about the topic. Okay, they are people who can generalize. They can take a concept and say, oh, well, that applies to this as well, and I understand that. Okay, and I would argue that if we're writing a textbook for an audience that is, it's an introductory type of textbook, they don't really, they're in this low structure building area. They don't know what to put together and how to organize the information. So that part of our job as the writer is to help them to organize the information in ways that make sense so they can understand more of it. So now that I've discussed who the readers are, who are we as the authors? And I would argue that we, because we are subject matter experts, we are these people. We are the high structure builders. We understand how the organization should be organized, how the material should be organized, and we are very abstract in our thinking about the material. And so, so I said, don't get caught in the expert blind spot, because there's the idea that we are experts, the reader is the novice, and we can't let out certain pieces of information that they need to understand what we're trying to tell them in the book. So don't get caught there. So what we're going to do next is, these are 4 of the topics that are in the Make It Stick book that both Karen and I have used in our books, that we wanted to show you some examples of, that we thought were helpful to help the reader, to build a structure for the reader so that they can understand more about our books. So this is the list. So we're going to start with build a structure. So that didn't come out right. What works better than just rereading? So this is a study. All right, well, because I didn't want you to look at the graph, so try not to look at the graph while I explain what the study is. Oh, gosh. So I told you about the high structure and the low structure builders. So Mark McDaniel's group at Washington University in St. Louis has a test that they can give to students to find out if they fall into the low structure category or the high structure builder category, the concrete versus the abstract thinker. And so he was curious as to if a textbook had embedded questions in it, if the low structure builders or the high structure builders, or both of them, would benefit from looking at a question that would guide their reading. And here are the results. And what can you see from the results? The embedded questions really helped the low structure builders. Yes, very good. Okay, so, and almost brought them up to the level of the high structure students. So if, helping the students get a structure there for what am I supposed to be reading for? What is the topic here? So, and so the control students were just asked to read, right? And then they were given the short exam, and that's a percentage they got correct. Yeah.
So I think there's 2 things you can deduce from this. So that helped the low structure builders, but also reduced the scores of the high structure builders. So they saw that as something that
it did reduce them a little. Yes, because they
they
already have a way of understanding the material, right? And so when they were required to look at the questions, it actually was a small detriment to them. Yeah. So now we're going to show you some examples from our textbooks, and Karen's going to talk a little bit about hers.
To generalize a little bit first, while this is geared towards textbook and classroom, the examples in the Make It Stick book are in anything that we learn. They use examples of baseball. I'm going to use an example about tennis. But for right now, so that's a learning process that really can go across the board. in anything that we do or that we teach or we're trying to get children to learn. Anyway, the students have a lot of questions, and when they come into chemistry for nursing, they're pretty intimidated. So I sort of automatically assume that we have low structure builders. They might be better in other classes, but in classes that intimidate them, they're fairly low structure. So I wanted them to stay in the class more than they were, and I started looking at pedagogy. At that time, my first book came out in '76. Our pedagogy consisted of questions at the end of the chapter and answers usually in an index. And that's come a long way in what we do in a textbook. But I took this Make It Stick book, and Laura and I talked about it, and I've been trying to, how would I adapt this to what's in the textbook as the student is going through it? And how can I cue the student to do some of these things you're seeing? So one of the things I've been doing is identifying the core skills, trying to give some hierarchy to the student about the areas we're talking about that are essential to building an understanding of the chemistry. And that is throughout, usually in the margin. And then also, if we go to the next one, it is reviewed again in a summary with an example at the end of the chapter. So I repeat the idea of what is important. And that's another thing about sort of carrying these ideas through the textbook, reminding them that these are important to know. Another thing I do, and we've been talking about embedding questions, I now have put in something called engage. And the idea I'm hoping will happen is that they will stop. I put this all in the preface, but I think they need cues about what they read because they closed the preface section and they're now into the chapter, and well, do those ideas come back to them? I'm not sure. But I try to then remind them that here are questions that they should stop, read and then stop and look to see how they could answer that question. Yeah.
When you said you put the, talking about how to do this in the preface, are you talking about the preface to the book?
Yeah.
Students never read the preface.
That's one main reason. Even if they don't, they're still here, so if they need to look it up. But I'm hoping, and we might discuss this, but I'm hoping at this point they will stop, look at that, look at the visual, look at the written, and come up with their answer. And this is using the information in small chunks and looking how questions might be written for that information, because sometimes I don't know what questions are related to. And my hope also is that they will devise new questions that might be asked of them on the exam, make up their own questions and answer them. Then they are kind of thinking like I do, and they're looking for those kinds of answers. So this is now throughout all my new editions. My first book never had any of this kind of thing. I don't know if we were discussing this at all in those days. Okay.
So
that's
this is the page from my textbook, and I do the same thing, but I don't call it engage. At the beginning of each section, I have these things called inquiry questions, which are, again, are these embedded questions, so the student can kind of guide, oh, this is what I'm supposed to be understanding about this section, is, in this case, how we classify carbohydrates. And at the end of the chapters, I have the learning outcomes clearly outlined here for the students, as well as a couple of problems to try, which we'll talk about a little bit later. And it's right next to this inquiry question, so they can, say, oh, these are the things that I'm supposed to understand from this section, and it should be pretty evident. Back to what Michael Spiegler had said a little earlier, students don't read the preface, but sometimes instructors will read some of the preface, and if they know it's there and they can point out the questions to their students, then we can get the students to see the questions. And so it really becomes somewhat of an instructor thing to, them to help guide their students by having them look at these questions. Another way you can build structure is by using contrasting examples, and part of this is because we store things by similarity, but we'll retrieve them back out of our memory by difference. And so to be able to contrast things as we are thinking about them the first time to store them is actually very beneficial. For example, here are some things that tend to be learned at the same time in books. Longitude and latitude. Those are two words that are very similar, and unless we can make a distinction in some way about which one's which, sometimes we confuse which one's which. Same thing with meiosis and mitosis. They sound very similar. If we learn them together at the same time, it becomes difficult for us to be able to bring them out and remember which one's which. So if you're teaching this or you're writing about this, it would make sense to really distinguish the two items before you start making similarities between the two. So try to discuss them one at a time. Here's an example of a problem from the textbook that I wrote. Here's a structure of how to do the problem, and you'll also see that there's two problems types that are contrasting to each other. So as the student goes through the problem, they're looking at, oh, this one was done this way, and this one is a little bit different, and it was done, I understand why the answers look different. Okay, so that's another an example of contrasting example. And Karen has something like that too.
But this is just another piece of providing information that they already know. In this case, I call it chapter readiness. A lot of times students finish a chapter and what do they do with it? Forget it, right? Even before the exam. And in chemistry, we keep building on information from chapter to chapter to chapter. Anyway, chapter readiness, I go back and list the key math skills because we also emphasize some very basic math skills that they need. And then the core chemistry skills again, which you saw in some of the earlier ones, at the beginning of the chapter where they need possibly to review them. Or they can go and say, I remember that, I don't remember that, go and look it up. But instead of their going back to find it, I have listed all the items that will be needed for the basis of what we're going to go on and do. Some students won't need that. It just depends on
okay, so
that
was the end of the first bullet point. I said there were 4 things we were going to talk about, which was the first one was trying to build a structure. So I hope you can see that there are some ways that maybe you can think about with your textbook writing that or your teaching that you can help to build structure for students. So next what we're going to do, this is, again, I told you there's audience participation. So this is you participating here. I'm going to show you a set of slides, and I want you to try to remember as much as you can from the slides. Okay, don't write anything down while you're doing this. Just look at the slides, okay? Is everybody ready? Okay. Okay, now we're going to take a test. Take one of these. got a bunch of copies here, so. Okay, so I've got the questions, and you write down the answers, okay? Okay, the first question is, which man used a feather? Number 2, which man ate dinner? Number 3, which man bought the broom? Number 4, which man picked up the chair? Number 5, which man read the sign? Number 6, which man gave the money to the robber? Number 7, which man looked closely at the wrapper? Number 8, which man ironed the sheet? Number 9, which man bought the crackers? Number 10, which man found the scissors? Number 11, which man used the phone? And number 12, which man went to work? Okay, now I'm not going to give you the answers quite yet. What I'm going to ask you to do is I'm going to show you another set of slides, and what I want you to do is try to think about something from your own mind that you can put to the slide, what's on the slide, so that you can remember it. So for example, if it said the hungry man got in the car, you might think to yourself, oh, to go to the restaurant, right? Or if it said the brave man ran into the house, you might say, oh, because he was trying to save the boy from the fire, that's why he ran into that, you know. So elaborate in your mind about this as I show you the next set of slides, okay? Okay, so you ready to look at another set of slides? Okay, now I'm going to ask you another set of questions. Number 1, which man counted the leaves? Number 2, which man looked at his new boat? Number 3, which man used the saw? Number 4, which man bought the mug? Number 5, which man put down the knife? Number 6, which man thanked the checkout girl? Number 7, which man threw out the coupon? Number 8, which man flicked the switch? Number 9, which man looked for the pole? Number 10, which man memorized the words? Number 11, which man wound up the clock? And number 12, which man hit the flea? Okay, now I'll give you the answers. So the first, the other thing was, sorry, I should have told you this before, you could have written your answers to the second set somewhere next to the first set, right? So for the first set of questions, the answers were, number 1 was dying. Number 2 was kind. Number 3 was short. Number 4 was rich. 5 was fat. 6 was brave. 7 dishonest. 8 frightened. 9 tall. 10 thin. 11 bald. And 12 was smart. Okay, so on the second set, Number 1 was Irish. Number 2, sad. Number 3, religious. Number 4, sleepy. Number 5, artistic. Number 6, weak. Number 7, bearded. Number 8, crippled. Number 9, long-haired. Number 10, patriotic. Number 11, evil. And number 12, blind. So my question is, how many of you got more words the second time than the first time? I would say a majority. How many people did better the first time? And that's what happens is some people already have a way that they are remembering things, and so some people will do better the first time, but the majority of people will do better the second time because they're not sure how to remember all that stuff the first time. So what I want you to do now is think about, yeah. Yeah. So think about why most people did better the second time than the first time, and how this might relate to textbook writing, and talk to the person next to you after you think about it on your own for about 30 seconds to a minute. So think on your own and then discuss with the person next to you. We'll share with everybody. Oops, I was just checking the time. Okay, so I'm kind of curious to hear some of the things that you were discussing at your tables. Why do you think that more people did better the second time? There's a big group back here.
Hold on a second, if you would, please.
That's right. Wait for the microphone.
So one of the things for me was I felt bad about how I did on the first one. And so when you gave me a strategy, I was like, okay, I'm going to take this strategy, but I'm going to try harder because I'm not a 7 out of 12. I'm a 12 out of 12. So it's like a motivating thing that now I'm going to really concentrate.
Other reasons, Steve? Back here.
1 second.
I actually went the other direction because in the first set, I was seeing the connections. I was making those connections in the original. When I did the second one, I was trying to make up things that weren't there to extend it to be something I was
So maybe you're a
familiar
high
with.
structure builder.
Hmm?
Maybe you're a high structure builder already.
I think maybe. So I did better on the first one than the second one.
By a lot or a little?
By a lot.
So I think the way that memory works is that you have to build a pathway to make the connection, to bring that information back to the surface. And it's easier to do that if you can connect new information to something that's already there,
Right.
where the pathway already exists. And so by associating the new information with something that I was already familiar with, made it easier to recall it faster.
Yeah, and I would bet that when you connected what was on the slide to something in your own mind, we didn't all think the same things. Right? Yes.
I'm glad we did this exercise. I'd love to do it with my students. But as an instructor, I had learned somewhere that adult learning theory was similar to this, where adults learn differently than kids. Kids memorize, and adults need to know why, and they attach it to something they already know. And so the second part seems like this one, where you relate it to something that you already know.
Yeah, so this is a strategy that you can use with, and you can use it with younger kids too. I mean, they don't just need to memorize. Kids can understand a lot more than we give it credit for. I think Al had one more comment, and then we need to move on.
I think for me, the more outlandish the extra information that I provided made me remember it more. Like the one that really sticks out to me was the long-haired guy who was trying to climb up a pole to try to have his hair stand on end to be as tall as he could be. And that's just such an elaborate, odd thing that somebody would do that really stuck in my mind.
It's a great visual, though,
Yeah,
that helps
exactly.
you to remember.
But probably different than anybody else.
Yeah, so this is a something that we understand from cognitive science to be called the generation effect. And this is that it's better remembered if you generate some of the information, okay? And so than just reading it, or than picking it from a multiple choice list. If you have to write something down, you will remember it. If you have to elaborate from your own mind, you will remember it better, okay? And so making associations will help us to retrieve information. This is also things like mnemonic devices. They fit into this category, this generation effect as well. It's something to help you remember the content. Okay, so, you know, I told you what to look for before you started looking at the list, and then you had to generate some of that. It's also, the other thing that falls into this is having, you know, students or readers look at something that maybe they don't understand before they actually read in detail about it, right? So some people, you know, they have their students, before they come to class, let's say, read something or try a problem, and the students will be like, I just couldn't get it. But they already are ahead of the game when they come into the class, and they're looking at it again because they've seen it before, right? So along with this is the idea of self-explanation. You have your own set of experiences, and you're linking those earlier experiences that you've had to the new information. So when you explain it to yourself, you understand it better. You have your own way of thinking about it. So that falls into this category as well. So what we're going to do next is show you how we have kind of leverage this idea of generation effect in some of the things in the books.
Okay. Trying to take the material in this book and then make it an active part of a textbook was my next goal. And I began to incorporate something that says try it first. And what we're trying to do, the key thing here is that the student doesn't go back and look it up. They try to generate what they think is the answer or part of the answer or whatever they can get to as an answer before they look at my solution. Don't want them to look at that because that's the way I did it. I want them to generate some ways in which they get a solution. And part of what the Make It Stick says, if students don't do it right, it's actually a benefit, because they know what to change the next time. So there should be expected errors made. These things are not all bad because we learned from making errors which path we want to follow that works better. So this idea of try it first is now put into every sample problem that I put in the textbook. And I keep reminding students to try to do this, how to do it, and it's just think about it from what you've learned. Do not sneak a look at the pages before. What did you absorb at that point? And then continue to check and see what more you need to study. And we also go on, and I added a component called Connect. What are some of the ways in which the given and the need can be connected? So this just moves through all the sample problems. And I think one of the, and this is also using color blocks to show the flow of various things that are part of the solution. And that was from an earlier book, and you notice it doesn't have try it first in it. But I think that children do a lot of this because they don't mind trial and error, and that's kind of what we're talking about. So I notice I watch my grandchildren learn computers when they're very little, and they don't mind going around and not doing what they need to do. They eventually hit it, and all of a sudden they've learned a computer just by trial and error. Very little was ever said to direct them. But that's sort of something we seem to have lost when we get older because we're afraid to make an error. And that's actually a good building point for making connections with the brain because we keep cementing the pathway that we want to use. So it's very exciting to take this material and look at how simple it is because it is a process that we do know how to use, and that's to do trial and error.
Okay, so we've gotten through two. We still have two more of these ideas from the book that we want to cover. So here's another true and false view. Again, if you think the answer is true, you raise one finger, and if you think it's false, oh, this is true statement, so it's not true and false. If you think number one is true, you would say one, and if you think number two is true, you would say two. So which of those statements do you think is true? Got a lot of twos. Yes, a test is a good way to strengthen learning. It's not necessarily a good way to measure learning because it is a static snapshot of one point in time regarding what the student knows on that given day under those conditions. And so here's how we can use testing, or what cognitive science literature likes to call retrieval practice, to strengthen learning. And before we talk about how we use it, I just wanted to give you a little bit of background from the literature. This has actually been known for quite a while. This study that I'm going to share with you is actually from 1967, but you know, who reads the educational literature? Let's just all write textbooks. So, two groups, they're both read the same story, and then the students that were read the story were asked to remember 60 concrete words from the story. There were 60 words, and they were asked about those words. The first group took kind of a quiz about a day later, and they remembered 53% of the words. The second group did not have that opportunity. And then at a later time, both of the groups took the same quiz again. The second group then remembered 39% of the words. The first group, excuse me. The second group only remembered 28% of the words. So what accounts for this difference in 11%? It's almost like the first group was protected against forgetting because they had a chance to retrieve the information one more time than the second group. Okay, so that was a very early study that was done. This one was done in 2006. And so the question that was asked here, and of course Roedinger is one of the authors on the Make It Stick book, was what works better, if the student rereads or if the student does a little bit of testing. So S, which you'll see in the figure, is rereading, and T is taking a recall test. And so what happened was there were 3 groups of students. One of the groups read the passage 4 times, and then the other 2 groups took various recall tests on the passage. After 5 minutes, a 5th test was administered, and you got the results shown here. So that looks like rereading actually worked. And it does to some extent. And in fact, students can cram for exams, and it actually is beneficial. They're, out in the hallway before the exam. Oh my gosh, I have to remember this, that, and the other thing. They run in and they write down all this information on their exam. What do you think happened after 1 week? The rereaders did so much worse than the students who had had to retrieve that information multiple times. So, for retention, I would say retrieval practice really works much better, just based on this data. So, to go back to this picture of, this is at the end of the textbook, where we've got the learning outcomes built out for the students. That's why there are these problems here, for them to go back and try to practice. Yeah. Oh, he needs the microphone.
So on the previous slide were the testing periods and the rereading periods the same amount of time?
Yeah, so the first 4 periods were sequential, and they were right after each other. So you read the passage, and then you read it again, or you took a recall test, then you read it again, or took a recall. Yes.
But the test, the amount of time that the test took was the same amount of time.
They
as
were
the
given the
reading.
same amount of time.
Right. And were any of the questions on the follow-up test the same as on the retrieval test?
No, it was a different test. Yeah. And the inquiry question is there too. So there's some retrieval practice. Karen's got something very similar.
Another thing, and we try to get students to go and work on the questions perhaps while they're doing the chapter. I actually moved all the questions at the end of the chapter into the separate sections so that they have a shorter chunk of information and they practice, again, not looking at it first and going to that set of problems and trying to remember how much of that they know. But now I'm also indicating test yourself, and the whole idea of retrieval is that it is practiced as often as possible. And that apparently is the main point in the make it stick. It's forming those connections so that when they get to an exam, we can put it in the brain, but what we want on an exam is that they retrieve it. And that's the step that a lot of studies or ideas that people have about what learning is missed. And it's very exciting, I think, and fairly simple. One of an example in the book is about baseball, where instead of drilling a player on hitting fastballs 5 times and then hitting curveballs 5 times, they alternate that. And each time, then they have to recognize what it is. They have to retrieve, this is going to be a curveball. I have to hit it this way. I do the same thing in tennis. Do you drill all on 4 hands? Which gets really boring anyway, which is part of how this changes study. Do you do all backhands? Do you do all 4 hands? Or do you practice recognizing the type of problem in chemistry, like you recognize this has to be a forehand, I have to prepare for this, put my racket back. Oh, this is going to be an overhead, I have to turn my shoulder, lift the racket. So it's an ABC, ABC. So each of those times is a recognition of problem and a preparation of doing what needs to be done. That is a lot more retrieval practice than drilling. And what do we do in a lot of our classes, especially in chemistry? We drill on one type of problem till it is really boring. We lose a lot of time with no retrieval practice. But if we mix the problems, and I do this later, I'll show you as I go through the book. Another way that we also, if you use click, oh, I'm sorry.
I have two quick questions. What's the relationship between the embedded question and the self-test question?
They're much the same. The engage occurs at the point in which it's part of the chapter. So they have the material aligned with the engage questions, but the self-test, they have to go to the problem set and find those problems. So they're remembering without seeing the material. So
Okay,
there's
the
a recall.
Engage is helping build the structure,
Yeah.
and the self-test
Yeah,
is
so this
testing your
step,
retention.
exactly.
Yeah.
Secondly, in the self-test, I notice your answers are right after it. Is there a difference between putting the answers right there and putting them like at the end of the book or online?
Yeah, I put all my answers now at the end of a chapter too. I closed up the index. I don't have any paging through the book to get to the end. But I'm thinking about taking them out again. I had them out and I had them at the end of the chapter.
Yeah, I've done
And
them
I
both
put them
ways,
in
too.
and I thought,
Yeah.
well, now wait a minute. Maybe now what I've learned, I should put them back in the answer section. So that's a point that I will consider as well. Yeah, I thought maybe that's a little too close now. Clickers, that's a retrieval exercise. You're kind of finding out how many students are understanding the information. And the next, okay, that's yours. You want to,
And this,
did you have
a comment? The clickers is a reinforcement strategy too, and if the students know they're going to be expected to respond to something, that increases their attention. So for years I've used like Compute Now quiz. So at the end of the lesson, they know that day they're going to be tested. They pay attention differently and then say, oh, well, I don't have to know till next week when we have a test.
yeah, which is great retrieval practice. Did they get it right then and there? And it helps the instructor to know whether they got it right then and there, right? So online homework, which a lot of companies have now or comes with textbooks, this is a great form of retrieval practice, right? It gives them the chance to practice outside of coming to class. Okay, so this is the last piece. This is the last thing that we wanted to talk about. So, and Karen talked a little bit about this already. True or false? 1 if you think it's true, 2 if you think it's false. That is false. Okay, and I've got one study to show you about this. And so mixing the ideas versus blocking the ideas is what we want to talk about here. Mixing is also referred to in the book as interleaving. Okay, so the study that was done in 2007, and there are many studies, and Rohr is the person who's done a lot of this work in interleaving. What they did is they had these tutorials on how to calculate the volume. This was a math study, how to calculate the volume of a certain shape. There were 4 tutorials, okay? So first tutorial, then there was a set of practice problems. So one of the groups did the tutorial, did the practice problems, which reinforced that they understood that tutorial. Second tutorial, practice problems. Third tutorial, practice. That would be blocking, okay? Do the tutorial. The second group watched all the tutorials and then did a mix of all the practice problems, okay? So here's what happened with the scores on the practice problems. The blockers got it. They did well on this, right? And when we have our students drill, okay, I got it, let's move on, right? This is what our students say. So what happened a week later when they took a test? Now, why do you think that is? Any ideas?
I would wonder about the quality of my teaching. I would be unhappy with both of the results. I would be wondering as a teacher about either the quality of my teaching or whether the background of my students was sufficient so that they should be tackling this material.
Okay, so just remember that these are controlled studies that were done in a lab. These are not classrooms where the study was done, okay? This was just a group that did this. Okay, can you hold on, because we're almost done and we need to show how we're doing this in the book. So blocking facilitates these similarities that I mentioned. We store on similarity, but we retrieve on differences, okay? And so the mixers were able to distinguish between what kind of problem should I use. This is what we ask our students to do on the tests, too. We don't ask them just one kind of problem. And so Karen's got some ways that she mixes.
Well, this is what I've actually been doing for a while, and instructors really like it. But it illustrates ways in how to mix information, and I always consider this a good test preparation because we don't give tests really in a blocking format. So this combines all the ideas into single questions from 3 chapters in this case. So it's all pulled together. They have to recognize the problem type. They have to retrieve how they need to approach it. And they are pretty well set up for exams because they have been doing that practice in a very similar way to test taking.
And this is kind of more information about interleaving versus blocking. And how what we mean by interleaving versus blocking. Okay, time to stop. Oh, we do?
Okay. Interleaving means that you are mixing problem types. So the recognition is different from one problem type to the next of what to do. I had another word for that, now I've forgotten. But yeah, I had to get used to that terminology. Interleaving, blocking is repetition of one skill.
Drilling.
Interleaving is using several different skills, like in the sports analogy. And these are a comparison of skills, blocking using AAA, one skill, and then moving on to B. Repeat, whereas interleaving is ABC, BCA, different orders of 3 skills, so that each time the student has to retrieve again what part of what they know they have to use. So there's a lot more retrieval practice.
We're talking about cognitive skills here, learning information. I'm just curious, do you think this would work for physical skills?
Yes.
That's what I was talking about. The tennis or the baseball player, and the analogies in Make It Stick are physical activities.
So that if you want to really get your backhand down, it'd be better to do a few backhands, then a few forehands, and a few overheads rather than backhand.
Well,
right.
in the game, you don't know what's coming at you, so shouldn't you practice that way?
Well, I have something else in mind.
Okay.
When as a pilot, we all practice landings all the time. That's the most difficult phase of flying. And I'll go out and I'll do 6, 7 landings in a row. And I find that some of them aren't great after a while. But then I'll just take off one day and land someplace and, I haven't done it in a while, but I've
Yeah.
I can do it. And I'm just wondering if I am defeating the purpose of practicing the landings by doing one right after the other.
Change landing fields.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
Isn't that, sometime you might have to land somewhere else. I don't know. A storm comes in, you can't land there.
Like a field or a highway, yeah.
Exactly. Maybe.
One moment here.
Right.
He has to interleave.
He has to interleave because he has to take off.
You can't just land and then land again.
Yeah, there's a story in the book about baseball hitters and how the hitters that don't know which pitch is coming are much better on average with their batting averages than the hitters that hit just fastballs and then hit just sliders and that kind of thing. So do you want to talk about this one? This is it. Okay. Okay. This is just my textbook has, one of the things students have problems with is balancing chemical equations. So there's several places where it's brought up in the book. So they have practice at balancing equations, which is, just a basic skill for chemistry. And then I would, suggest developing sets that bring in material from previous chapters. You want to talk about this, or? Okay. So we're back to the 4 that we wanted to talk about here, and I just wanted to put those up for, just for closure, summary. These are things that we learned from reading the book, and I think it's, the idea is to have somebody learn something from what you write. So I think these things can help. That's just our, yay, it's helping the students. And so I want to thank you for your attention, and I think we have time for questions.
Yeah, we do.
Okay.
One comment about the preface: it's important to introduce the pedagogy and so on in that format. To improve the student readability of the preface, the author should write the preface, not an editor, not a marketing person. The preface should be written to the student. It could say preface to the student. If there's some stuff to the teacher, that could be at the end of the preface, or call it a prologue. But write it to the student in that verb tense. You're counseling and sitting at the table with them, and that increases the utility of the preface.
Yeah. I do write the preface to the student, and I use you, and also we have a walkthrough, which again is a visual about seeing those sorts of things that they'll see in the margins and so forth. And that's interleaving as well.
Yeah, I have a question that you may not have an answer to, but I'm going to ask it anyway, hoping you might. And that is, when you adopt some of these learning things, advances in learning theory and so on, and you practice them in your textbook or in your teaching, I've experienced some pushback because that's not the right way to do it. And
well,
that's what they're coming.
So
you don't do it that way. That doesn't work that way. How can that possibly be? Like, I've been doing the online retrieval practice for 16 years using homegrown online homework, and my colleagues just thought that was ridiculous, doing all this online testing, especially because I was giving credit for it. And I was, well, it's an open book. They can, and I'm like, yeah, I hope they open the book, and I hope they ask each other help, and I hope that, because I want them to get to a point where they know it inside and out. And when I got to the exams, boy, it blew me away. They were doing great on their exams, but you still have that pushback from the colleagues. And I don't care about what my colleagues think of my teaching, but I do care as a textbook author, because that affects adoptions, that like, oh, well, that's just a crazy book because it's got all this weird stuff in it that can't possibly
well, that's
work,
why this book is so useful, because it's the evidence that it works. Yeah.
One thing, students don't know how to learn when they come in the chemistry class. So trying to, and if they do have their own way of learning, I just expect them to not pay that much attention to it because they can just check off that supposedly they know what they're doing. But yeah, I try not to get too far afield with ideas that will turn off an adoption as well.
Well, the other thing is that the interleaving is more effortful. It takes more effort to go back and think about things that you thought you learned before and bring them back up. It's harder for the students. They don't necessarily like it.
It's more disruptive in a way. It's, I mean, the easy way to think about is to do one thing at a time. It's the least effort. And one thing that they say, again, and make it stick, learning has to be work and it has to be effort, and it doesn't have to feel that good all the time, but there is more learning when it's not so easy, or they think it's easy till they take the test.
I just wanted to kind of follow up on that, it being so hard and the pushback. I read this book a little while ago, and I happened to be taking Tai Chi lessons at the same time, which I'm offering as a recommendation to continually try to learn new things so that you can feel what it's like to be a student. And it was an amazing experience because as you read this book, my Tai Chi teacher was using these principles without realizing there was all this evidence behind it, maybe, I don't know, or maybe because he's teaching an ancient form that they've worked out some of these issues. But the point is that he was telling me if you, I'd make mistakes all the time because I'm not a very coordinated person and I'm trying to do all these smooth moves, right? And he said, well, you can't learn Tai Chi unless you make mistakes. You can't learn it until you make a mistake, which is exactly what they say. So he was like following the chapters without even really realizing it. But that is a real big issue, is the harder it is, the better. And I've spent my career trying to make it easier for my students. And now I'm realizing maybe that wasn't such a good idea. And maybe in textbook authoring, maybe that's not such a good idea
I think
either.
it's just a matter of seeing that in your own experience that makes a huge difference. And Bill and I have been taking ballroom dance the last 5 years. And you learn some patterns and you go back and incorporate that. And I told the teacher, the pro, you're using the same examples that this book I'm reading do.